Hello, hi everyone, and welcome to another edition of Inside HR with me, James Marsh. This week, in association with our friends at Culture Amp, we're going to be taking a look into performance management and specifically the art of goal setting. Continuous goal management means that employees do not need to set goals on a specified cadence or update them at regular intervals. Rather, employees are encouraged in this approach to set goals in alignment with how they actually get their work done. The key to a continuous approach to goals is that more regular discussions about goals, goal progression, or potential barriers and goal relevancy are conducted. And I'm joined today by Alex Alvarez, who's going to help me break all that down from our friends at Culture Amp. But before I introduce him, just let me give you a quick reminder that there are loads of different ways in which you can get involved in our webinar over the next hour or so. It's a pleasure to welcome Alex to Inside HR for the first time. He is a senior people scientist at Culture Amp. As a member of the people science team, Alex partners with customers in collecting, understanding, and acting on employee feedback through best practices and applied organizational psychology. He primarily supports customers in the EMEA region with strong focus on the UK market. And prior to joining Culture Amp, Alex worked for several years consulting with a wide range of clients across multiple industries on employee engagement, employee experience related topics. He received his MSc in organizational and social psychology from the London School of Economics. He's an experienced presenter on issues related to engagement, performance management, and all topics around this: employee experience, trust in senior leaders, behavioral change. Alex, welcome to Inside HR. How are you doing?
Hi, James. Thank you. Yeah, I'm very good. Thank you. Thank you for having me here today.
No, it's been really great talking to you about this during the week, and I'm really excited about the hour we've got ahead. We're going to take a really deep dive into the essence of what goals are, and let me just put up our agenda for this morning over the next hour. We're going to start by reviewing how we define goals themselves and some of the reasons why they're so important to an organization. We'll then have a chat a bit about goal setting and what a goal setting journey could look like for your employees and your organization. And then we'll end our conversation by reviewing with Alex some best practices that employees, managers, and leaders can use as they create, set, and track their goals. Let's start, Alex, by talking a bit about Culture Amp themselves. We've done some work with Culture Amp before. We've done podcasts and webinars with Culture Amp, but just give us a quick overview of Culture Amp and what they do.
Yeah, so for those of you that are not familiar with Culture Amp, we are the world leading employee experience platform. We partner with over 5,000 companies worldwide and help them leverage on people's insights, data, in order to make improvements in their organizations. We really understand that impacting the employee experience and understanding it can be difficult. You need insights from the whole employee experience cycle, and Culture Amp has built a complete platform based on people science and technology. So for those of you that are interested in finding out more, please get in touch.
And your job title is people scientist, and you talk about the people science department. What does people science mean in essence, Alex?
Yeah, no, I have to say, great introduction. I couldn't have done it better, so thank you for that.
It's a great term, isn't it? People scientist.
Yeah, I love that. So yeah, it's basically the team that focuses on understanding how people feel, think, and ultimately behave within the context of work and within an organization. So we constantly focus on finding out the latest research and sharing that with our customers.
Brilliant. There's this quote, Alex, that you and I talked about during the week. It's from Tony Robbins, who's an American business strategist and life coach. Setting goals is the first step from turning the invisible to the visible. That's obviously a quote that sort of summarized goal setting for you. Just tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I find this quote particularly empowering because if you think about goal setting, it always comes from a desire to change something. So either to improve or to make something different or better. But oftentimes we can get we get caught up. Other things take priority, and we forget to take the first step. And that's a step of crafting, defining, refining the actual goal in itself. I think that's a key part of turning something that is a desire into reality. So that's why I find this quote very empowering, and it makes a lot of sense, turning the invisible into the visible. Now, I'm sure, I don't know, our audience, our attendees can relate to having a time in your life at work or your personal life where you want to change something, and then what happens? Then, you know, other things take priority. New Year's resolution are a good example of that. You know,
I don't think, what's the longest you've stuck with a New Year's resolution, Alex?
well, I have to say,
you're really quite good at this, aren't you? You're good
I really stick to it. But the problem with New Year resolutions is that they're too generic, and people tend to give up by February. So I'm hoping that as we go through today's webinar, people can pick one or two things on how to better set goals and share that in their organizations. Because I think when you get the principle of setting effective goals, it can really make a difference as in how you go about it and how you achieve things. So,
and I think probably what's important with that, Alex, is to start by actually defining what a goal is. Take it really down to brass tacks, because as you say, when people set goals in terms of things like New Year's resolutions, they tend to be general, they tend to be non-specific. I want you to set out exactly what you think a goal is.
Yeah, sure. I think the thing with any concepts within the area of organizational development is that you can find hundreds of different definitions depending on the author. So obviously here we have a few. The one that I really like is that idea that a goal is some outcome that wouldn't otherwise happen without some sort of intervention. The reason
something's got to change.
That's right. And I think it makes it links it to an intentional decision. So it requires action, it requires effort, it requires changing your behavior to achieve something. Now, if you think about organizations, they set goals all the time, every day. The most common ones are financial goals. We hear organizations that want to improve revenue growth by 15% by the end of the quarter, for example. That's a financial goal. Then you have, from a people perspective, as part of the conversations I have with my customers, they're really focused nowadays on mitigating or reducing turnover rates. It's quite front of mind for a lot of organizations. I guess what I'm trying to say is that there are different type of goals, and we'll identify some of the key ones today. And hopefully people can get a good understanding of how to better set goals and how to better track them to be successful.
Before we look at the different types of goals, let's talk about the purpose of setting goals. As you say, there's something's got to change. There's an intervention required. What does goal setting actually do? Why is it so important?
I think the third thing is to reflect on why people don't set goals. And as part of the conversations I have with my customers, oftentimes I see three main reasons. My customer always tell me about, we're too busy, we don't have enough time to pause and reflect to set goals. So I think that's a challenge in a lot of organizations. The other reason is that they don't really know where to begin. Oftentimes, goal setting is seen as a big undertaking, and people get a bit confused as in where to start. And finally, the third reason is people don't have a strong enough reason why to set the goal. Those are the main barriers. So highlighting why goal setting is important becomes fundamental. So as you can see here, if we cover from left to right, setting goals can provide a sense of direction. And that's very important because it touches on a psychological need, the need of making progress. So if you think about your job or what you do, we all want to make progress and feel that we're heading somewhere. So having a clear sense of direction, that North Star, becomes fundamental, because otherwise, imagine if you enter a race, you don't really know where you're going, or even if there is a finish line, it would feel very painful.
You would run it differently, right? If it was 200 meters or 15,000 meters.
Yeah, exactly. In having that clear sense of direction can also help you sift through any distractions. So oftentimes we get distractions on a daily basis, but understanding what you're trying to achieve can really put your mind or focus your mind on specific tasks. Then goal setting also is proven that increases motivation. So if you envision an outcome or the sense of accomplishment that you will get after you have achieved something, that can feel very motivating. And again, when we are experiencing challenges, roadblocks, having that end goal in mind, that outcome that we mentioned earlier, can be very powerful. And the final bit is that sense of alignment between what I'm trying to achieve and a broader purpose. So the organizational goals, my team goals. And again, that touches into a psychological need, which is the need for meaning and purpose at work. So when we really understand how what we do fits into something bigger, again, it can be very, very powerful to keep working on specific tasks and achieve certain outcomes.
And I'm assuming that's a huge part of your role as a people scientist going into the organizations HRreview works with is understanding not just goals on an individual or team basis, but also aligning them through the organization.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's something that I make sure I cover with my customers as part of the conversations we have about goals or performance management related topics.
To continue the discussion, Alex, you touched on this earlier, that there are different types of goals. Just talk through how you see those different types and the categories you see them falling into.
Yeah, as I alluded to earlier, so we have different types of goals in organizations. I think it's very beneficial to focus on the individual types of goals that we have. So we start from the kind of ground up. And oftentimes individual goals take two forms. One, on the one hand, you have delivery goals. On the other hand, you have development goals. But as we can see here, they are connected. Delivery goals tend to be more about the outcome. So they are outcome and task oriented. So oftentimes we refer to this, or we might hear in organizations, people talk about this as business or performance goals. And as I said, they focus on the task. So in a nutshell, is what needs to get done, right? So just to give you an example, let's say there is someone that works in marketing, and they've been asked or they have set a goal to improve the click-through rate. So for those of you familiar with marketing, is when you have an email campaign and you get stats on how many people are actually seeing those emails. So there are tasks with improving the click-through rate by 20% by the end of the quarter, for instance. So that's a very clear, specific, task-oriented goal, right? Now, how does it link to development? So development goals are learning-oriented, and these are goals where you need to define what are the gaps in your knowledge, your skills, even your behaviors that can potentially support you to improve on how you deliver on your delivery goals. So if we take the same example of the marketing coordinator, let's say that person is fairly new in their career, and they realize that in order to improve the click-through rate, you need to make the email campaign more visually appealing, but their skills in terms of creating visuals is limited. So a development goal could be, okay, I'm going to take an online course on how to create visually appealing emails, for example. So there you can see how, on the one hand, you have the delivery goal, the task-oriented, but then by identifying any gaps in knowledge, skills, etc., you can complement that to improve how you perform.
And that when that goal-setting process happens, managers should be aware of that link and maybe hopefully setting goals that complement each other, right?
Absolutely. And I think that's why we recommend having regular conversations. We'll see, I guess, in just a moment, the results of the poll, but that's a challenge with the yearly event that oftentimes when customers come to Culture, they come with that approach of having a yearly event, and we help them change that. And that's one of the main reasons that if you don't have regular conversations, as you alluded to, it's very likely that you'll forget even what the goal was in the first place.
So as we talked about, these development goals and delivery goals, sorry, they overlap. They have to complement each other. And then there's a sort of, the way you've set this out here, Alex, is sort of a linear process where they then come together for then a process of setting and then reviewing goals as and when they're completed.
Yeah. This is presented in a linear way just for to understand it. Yeah, visually to make it easier to understand. But yeah, it definitely should be happening regularly. So the journey oftentimes starts with the big picture. So that's when leaders communicate the strategy to the business, what their expectations are for the year or even for the next several years. And that usually gets broken down into division or even team level, department level. So that's the first step, really understanding what the company that you work for is trying to achieve. Then we move into the self-reflection stage. So that's an opportunity for employees to think about how they can contribute to that bigger purpose or that bigger organizational or team goal.
And that depends not just on their skills, Alex, it depends on their role within the organization as well, right? So if I'm the marketing coordinator, how does my role contribute to that big picture?
Absolutely. And how you contribute, and also at this stage, maybe you identify development goals, right? Like you realize, okay, maybe there is a gap in my skill set, knowledge, behaviors that I need to take into account. And that's why, as you can see, the visuals here, there is a link with the self-reflection linked to development goals, right? So they can be happening in parallel. After that, we move into drafting the goals. So that's literally the act of writing it down and sharing that with your manager before having a conversation, so that your manager has an opportunity to review what you're thinking about doing.
That's really interesting, Alex. So you would suggest for any employee, before having the actual meeting where you're going to set those goals, write a draft and have a sort of a preliminary discussion, or even just an opportunity for your manager to have a look at your thinking on your goals prior to having that conversation. What does that allow both parties to do?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it gives both parties time to set a goal that is meaningful, that is not rushed, right? You're not just trying to set a goal to tick a box. You're really thinking about, okay, what am I trying to achieve here? But as I said, you also give your manager to think about, okay, how can I support my employee on achieving this? Or how can I help them redirect if maybe it's not really aligned with an organizational or team goal? Or how can we have two things, one that maybe is more related to the organizational goals, another one that is more linked to what the individual wants to achieve from a career perspective. So I think, having that time, allowing people to have that time, at least even if it's a couple of days before the actual conversation, it can really help with that when that conversation takes place.
Just one more thing I wanted to pick up with you, Alex. You mentioned that the employee drafts the goals. Do you think that the best practice is the onus is on the employee to come up with the goals or the nature of the goals for that discussion, rather than the manager coming up with goals for the employee?
Yeah, absolutely. I think when it starts with the individual and there is a personal interest in something in particular, that motivational side is going to be more powerful than if you get given something. And by all means, you can start with something and then have that collaborative approach with your managers where they will have a say as well. But yeah, definitely, I think it should start with the individual.
Okay, so we've drafted the goals, and then we go in to have the discussion about the goals. Talk us through the process from there.
Yeah, so this is a part where you actually have a conversation. You really understand, put on the table what you're trying to achieve, how it links to the organizational goals. Your manager might give you feedback and might say, okay, maybe we can refine this in a specific way. we're going to cover the principles in more detail in just a moment. But then, yeah, this is also an area, as we said earlier, where the employee and the manager might realize, okay, maybe it's a bit too much of a stretch. In order to achieve that, maybe you will need certain training, or you might need to shadow somewhere, etc. So, or we might need extra resources. So that's why the delivery and the development goals are very, very much linked. And after that discussion, well, it's just a process of setting the goal, putting it on a system, on a visible system. Culture provides a digital platform for it, and then sharing the goal with your team members and with your manager to create a sense of accountability. So you're really putting out there what you're committing to achieve. And especially when it comes to not just employees, if you think about leaders, it's very important that they set the tone by making their goals very visible.
And then post setting the goal, we talked about that annual process where they then get revisited a year later. How often should those goals be revisited and reviewed and discussed?
We recommend that it takes place at least monthly, but I have some organizations that do it every week, or even every 2 weeks in some cases. So way more regularly than even monthly. So again, it doesn't have to be a big undertaking. It can be a 10, 15-minute conversation as part of a bigger meeting, for example, where you keep the goal top of mind. So you're checking, okay, are we making the progress that we expected? Do we need to shift or pivot in any way because we have new information? I think COVID is a clear example of this.
Well, right? That was going to be my next question. Is obviously when more sort of macro external events or conditions or climates change, COVID being the classic example. I mean, I was working for a retailer during COVID, and obviously all of our targets, goals, KPIs, sales figures, everything changed the moment we hit late April 2020, and they were a constant moving goal after that. How have you been advising organizations to approach that goal setting conversation during the last couple of years as the goals keep moving and the circumstances keep changing?
Yeah, I think that's why this regular approach, this regular check-in is so important, because imagine if you had set a goal in, as you alluded to, in early 2020, and then you only check a year later or 6 months later, it would be way too late. So having these regular conversations allow you to, shift or pivot according to the new information, new context. Context is just so important. How do I advise clients? Is definitely have honest conversations about what is realistic to be achieved, but also ambitious, so it's that striking that balance of, okay, we want to be realistic based on the current context, but we want to stretch ourselves as well, so that the goal is motivating. So I think that's a key component of shifting depending on the context or new information.
Absolutely. I mean, it was difficult, wasn't it, for definitely the first year of the pandemic to understand what a realistic goal might be, because I think the conditions were changing almost every week. Let's go back and quickly look at that that poll that we started about how frequently managers and employees are having conversations about goals. Maybe this would have been a different set of results 2 years ago, but now 21% still saying yearly. That's really interesting. Over a fifth of our audience still saying yearly, 30% saying every 6 months, 31% are quarterly, 15% monthly, with just 1% saying that they discuss goals on a weekly basis. Again, Alex, I guess I'll ask you, is that sort of, does that line up with your experience working with your clients? You've still got 21% there having a goal conversation once a year. That's quite interesting.
Yeah, that's something we see quite often when customers come to Cultram to begin with, and we start working with them. That yearly approach is still in big numbers in a lot of organizations. So yeah, hopefully by either working with Cultram or attending these types of webinars, we start creating that shift because definitely that yearly approach is very limited in terms of how things are achieved or how motivating it is for employees. I think that example you gave earlier, that we need to spend the first half remembering what the goals are, will resonate with a lot of people if you do it here.
Yeah, absolutely. Is it possible though, Alex? I read and we've been reading on HRreview and other places for years now about the concept of the annual appraisal and how that's dying or dead. Is it still possible to have an annual formal appraisal process, but still have informal conversations with your team, with your direct reports about goals on a monthly or weekly basis anyway? Is it possible that the two can be side by side?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the hybrid approach is very common. I think the yearly conversation is kind of the end of the whole process, in the sense of, if organization assign ratings, they don't want to be assigning ratings all the time, right? So they want to ensure that they are meaningful and that you have enough information to evaluate or assess someone. So yeah, having a mix of regularly monitoring progress, having those conversations, asking how you're doing, what you need to change, etc., allows for the whole process to be perceived as more as fair. I think fairness is a key component of those regular conversations, that there are no surprises at the end of that year, if you will, on how you will be evaluated, because you have regular conversations along the way.
I had I can remember my annual appraisal after the first one I had during the pandemic. And I can remember going through my goals and just sitting there going, not achieved, not achieved, not achieved, not achieved. And that is quite a dispiriting experience, isn't it? It's so important for you to have those conversations in between those annual reviews. Alex, I know we've talked a lot about the what so far in terms of goals. What are goals? What do goals look like? What does a goal process look like? I know you wanted to take a minute and talk about the how as well, because the how is really important, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. And we touched on the co-creation earlier, but just to reiterate the point, you asked me, should it start with the individual or should it be the manager? And I think it's a combined approach. That co-creation shows that goals are set more effectively and achieved. So it leads to higher performance based on research. And most of the time we think that it's because of the alignment and the motivational side. And obviously that plays a key role. But I think the other part of it, why co-creation leads to higher performance, is because as part of those conversations between employees and managers, you can really come up with different strategies, right? If you're struggling with something, as part of that collaborative approach, your manager might point you in the right direction or to the right person to help you. And that's why we see improvements in performance. Documenting the goals is also critical, making it visible and something that you can revisit so that you don't just forget about it. And it's proven that it helps to increase commitment to achieving goals if you document it. And the last bit of it is making it visible. I mentioned this as well, but when you make it visible, either if you're a leader, you make it visible to your employees, or you're an employee, you make it visible to your manager and peers, for example. You create a social, psychological contract where not fulfilling or not achieving the goal becomes part of a kind of an integrity thing. You feel like, okay, I said that I would do this, so I really need to go for it. So those are the three key things that people should bear in mind when creating, on how to create or how to set goals.
I'm sure you've seen lots of creative ways organizations can make goals visible. Obviously, my experience is from retail and hospitality, where often we had performance targets on a whiteboard in an office in one of the sites, in one of the stores, or what have you, and you would see teams gather around the board as the board was updated to see if they'd hit their daily or their weekly sales target. I was wondering if you had any examples of how organizations have made goals visible in a really engaging and fun way.
Yeah, I think nowadays we see a lot of digital tools, right? Goaltran provides that that platform to make things very visible, where you can, in the flow of work, access to your personal site, if you will, and they have a specific task that you just click a button and then you can see that and review things. But yeah, in terms of different ways, yeah, as you alluded to, there are some people that create kind of launch events in terms of goals, just to make it engaging and fun, to begin with. And then as they go through the process, obviously it becomes part of how you can fit it into the way that people work. I think that's a key part, that you don't have to reinvent or create something from scratch, but that you can fit it into the way that people work.
And I know, Alex, you wanted to take a minute and talk about SMART goals. Now, I know a lot of our audience would have seen this. Some of you may be very early in your careers, or maybe even in education. SMART goals are something that are talked about, all the way through business and management educations before you even get into roles in organizations. But I think there's a lot of value here, Alex, in just taking a quick sort of deep dive into SMART goals, because we can all recite what all the different letters stand for, but we often lose sight of these during a goal setting process in an organization, don't we?
Yes, absolutely. I think the SMART framework is very well known, as you said, but I think there is power in reviewing fundamentals or basics all the time. I think I usually use the analogy of learning to play a specific sport, for example. Whether you play golf or tennis or whatever it is, oftentimes when you make improvements, it's because you need to go back to certain basics that you're not doing right. So I think having this framework can be very useful if you revisit it, keep it top of mind. So I think a good way of understanding it is, okay, what is a not so SMART goal, right? Like, so let's say I say, okay, I'm going to run 2 more webinars, and I want to increase attendance and improve satisfaction rates, right? So that's not a very SMART goal, because it's not very specific. And that's the fundamental, the first part of a SMART goal is for the goal to be very specific, very intentional on what you're trying to accomplish. So a better goal would be, okay, what if I say, okay, I want to run 4 more education webinars by the 10th of June. I want to have at least 100 attendees and a satisfaction rate of 80% per session, for instance. So as you can see there, it's very specific. Okay, what am I trying to accomplish? Well, I'm trying to plan and execute 4 customer education webinars. It's very explicit. It's also measurable, right? That's the other key element of a SMART goal, that you know how you're gonna achieve success. You know how you will know if you have achieved the goal, right? And in this case, if you think about the execution part of the goal of planning and executing 4 webinars, would be, okay, if I reach 80% satisfaction rate, I know I'm successful, right? So it's measurable. If I know if I planned it very well, if I get at least 100 attendees, so that means I communicated up front that the webinar was coming, I really work on the campaign, etc. The goal also needs to be attainable, and I touched on this as well. You want to make it attainable but ambitious. So it's a bit of a balance, right? It's something I know I can achieve, but also it's a bit of a stretch, so that it motivates me. And if I know it's a bit too much of a stretch, it might allow me to, okay, improve and set development goals, as we mentioned.
And is that Alex? Is that where the manager's experience comes in as well? If you're saying that these goals are being initially originated by the employee, and the employee comes into the meeting and says, "I want to do this, and I want to set it at number X," that's where the manager can come in and say, "Actually, number Y is probably more attainable. Should we go for that?"
Absolutely, yeah. So that co-creation comes in place, because, yeah, the manager will have a say as in, Maybe we have specific targets that we need to hit, or things that we need to achieve within this quarter. What about if you focus on X and then we leave Y, for the next quarter? Because then we'll have more time. So that's why I said earlier that context matters a lot on how you go about setting goals. Making it relevant and aligned, we touch on this, that element of understanding the bigger picture, how what you do has an impact, can create meaning and purpose. And finally, making it time bound. So the example I mentioned, it was, okay, I want to run 4 webinars, plan and execute 4 webinars by the 10th of June. It makes it very specific in terms of time constraints so that I can focus my attention on the goal. We said earlier that New Year's resolutions, people usually give up by February because oftentimes they don't have a deadline. It's like, okay, what do you want to do this year? Okay, I want to lose weight. It's very generic. It doesn't have a specific deadline, right?
Putting specifics on that kind of goal can be very, very, very challenging.
Exactly. And it's challenging because it's not...
People find that scary, don't they?
Yeah, and it's not broken down to the level of detail. Like, better than losing weight, it could be specific, and you say, I'm going to work out at least once every 2 weeks to begin with for the first quarter, for example. That could be more attainable, etc. So I think reviewing the fundamentals of the SMART goal and applying it to what you do can be very, very useful.
And with SMART goals, you talked earlier about the difference between delivery goals and development goals. Setting a SMART goal in terms of delivery can be often quite straightforward, as you said, because there are metrics inbuilt that often measure attainment, whether it's financial figures, whether it's percentage of page looks, whether it's whatever it is that you mentioned earlier. Can setting SMART goals when it comes to development be slightly more nuanced and more tricky, Alex?
Potentially, but I think you can always find ways of measuring, of making your goals specific. So, for instance, if we go back to the example of the marketing coordinator, right? So that person had to improve how to create visually appealing images, right? So that's very specific. I want to improve something in particular. Now, how do I know if that's the case? I guess that could be more nuanced. But for instance, if I join a course, oftentimes courses have some sort of test at the end of it or throughout the course. So I could potentially set a development goal by saying, okay, I need to hit at least a 75% percentage of success in each of the modules of the course, for instance. Is it attainable? I think so. I have the time, etc. Is it relevant? Definitely, because it links to that delivery goal that is important for the company. And it's time bound because you're joining a course and it will take place within a specific span of time. So I think the more nuanced part of a development goals could be the measurement side. But I think if you think through, or you co-create with your managers, definitely you can find ways of making it very visible and measurable.
Before we move on, I want to have a look at just what our audience have been telling us through our final poll. Remember, we asked, what type of goals have you set so far this year? 3% have said none so far, probably a large Venn diagram overlap with the 2% that we're struggling to understand how to set goals. 24% have set delivery goals. 8% have set development goals, with 61% saying that they set both types. And 3% are in the other column. Perhaps if you're in that 3%, why don't you tell us a little bit more by asking us a question, and we can have a look through that in the last 10 minutes. We're really interested to get your perspective on how maybe you're doing something different. But Alex, 61% saying that they set both types, which is really interesting. With 24 just setting delivery goals, that accounts for 85% of the response. That's quite encouraging, right? You're seeing over 60% setting both types of goals.
I think definitely very encouraging, and it's something that we're seeing more nowadays. I think a lot of organizations recognize that investing time and resources in developing their people is fundamental. If you think about the kind of classical old approach of you're hired to do a job and you're paid for it, so you're expected to perform and you should have all the answers. Well, we know that that's not the case, that we are always going to have room for improvement. So seeing that more people are setting both types of goals is very encouraging and great to see.
Before we talk about how to track goals and then leave you some time to talk about just some key takeaways, Alex, I wanted to talk a little bit about objectives, organizational objectives, and as we touched on earlier, how that then cascades down into a goal for an individual. And you have a term here that you use here, which is objective and key results, or OKRs. Just explain to us what an OKR is.
Yeah, absolutely. So OKRs are a framework that is used in organizations to achieve objectives. And so the objectives, key results, and then you have tasks. So oftentimes they start with a leader defining a high-level qualitative type of goal that tends to be inspirational. So that's an objective. It's a bit more generic. But then you make the link to the measurable, the quantifiable part, the key results. And then you break it down even further into tasks. So just to give you a quick example. So let's say there is an organization that wants to create a high-performing customer service team. Mm-hmm. That would be kind of an inspirational, very qualitative, more generic type of objective. Mm-hmm. In order to achieve that, to have a high-performing customer service team, I need to have key results. So, for example, I can say, okay, I want to decrease the number of escalated calls that I receive at the moment from 30 to 10% by the end of the quarter. So that's an example of how you can also use the principle of the SMART goal, right? In together with OKRs, you can still apply them. You might want to increase customer satisfaction ratings by 15% by the end of the quarter as well. And maybe you want to decrease the amount of time that people take to get back to customers by 10% by the end of the quarter. So those are three key measurable results that if you achieve them, you know you are being successful in achieving that objective. But then again, you can go even further down. How do I create tasks? So as a manager, for example, I'm going to set a task of analyzing 2 customer calls per week, and I'm going to provide feedback to my team members. I'm going to provide coaching every month to my team members, to my whole team, based on the feedback or the insights I get from analyzing calls. So you see, that's a clear example of how OKRs start with an inspirational objective, and then you make the link to very specific and concrete results and tasks.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And in terms of then tracking those goals, Alex, obviously we've talked about this already, about the need to constantly, check in on goals, review goals. At HRreview, just talk to us a little bit about the advice you give around how you track goals through a performance period, or however long that period is.
Yeah, so we provide a module that we call one-on-one, where you can set an agenda, you can have your goals there, so that is very visible, and so it's a prompt for the conversation. But I think the most important part is the type of questions that you bring up in those one-to-ones. So questions such as, how are we progressing? Are we on track to hit our next milestone? Is there anything new or any blockers or any challenges you're experiencing that I can help you with, right? Mm-hmm. To understand if someone is struggling to make progress. Is the goal still aligned with the bigger objectives, or anything changed because of, nowadays change, is part of our lives with global pandemics, sadly a war, etc. So things shift all the time. So being able to bring up those conversations those questions is fundamental. And then again, should we prioritize a specific element of your goal. So it's not to say that we should move the goalposts all the time, but to be very open and honest about the current context and how we need to adapt based on that. And the second part of it is to recognize and reward not just when people achieve their goals, but small accomplishments along the way. I think that's a very important part. If you only focus on the outcome, it's very likely that people will game with the metrics. And what I mean by that, for instance, if you have a sales team and you only recognize them for hitting targets, it's very likely that when they feel under pressure to hit the target, especially before the end of the quarter, they might inflate claims of what your product or services do because they're just focused on achieving the target. So really rewarding and recognizing persistent small accomplishment can help with that. Conversations, as part of conversations I have with my customers, quite a lot of them are trying to anchor things to their values as well. So it's not about just what you achieve, but how you achieve them, and anchoring on the values, on the behaviors that are expected, is a good way of having a balance.
That's such an interesting point. It is that without that regular review and recognition, and what you're saying is that actually goals, the pursuit of goals, can compromise the adhering to values or even ethical practice.
Absolutely. Yeah.
That's really interesting. Before I'm going to allow Alex to just have a minute or two to give us his key takeaways. Before that, I want to remind you that we are going to be then open for questions. So please click on the Ask a Question tab and you can ask Alex anything and I will read it out to him and we'll have a discussion based on the questions that you want answered. That's something we always do on Inside HR. I've also got a moment here just to direct you towards some fabulous attachments we have available this week. They're from HRreview. Obviously, we've got an ebook on goal setting for agile teams. We've got a guide on team goals and alignment. We've got the HR Agile Guide to Performance, and there's also an article in there about SMART goals as well, and sort of really how SMART goals can be applied in a smarter way. So please do get involved with that. Have a look at those. You can download those from HRreview's website. Alex, before we get into questions, your key takeaways for today.
Yeah, I think the third thing is to get to empower employees and individuals to drive to begin with the conversation and co-create goals with their managers. It's a key element. Also, frequently revisit the goals, as we said several times throughout this session, and then ensuring that your goals are adaptable and that you adjust according to the context or new information within reason, right? As I said, we don't want to be moving the goalposts all the time, but being aware of the context and flexible can really help with setting goals more effectively and ultimately improve performance.
Thank you so much for your insight, Alex. It was absolutely fascinating. We're now going to open it up to our audience questions. We've got some amazing ones coming here. Let me just have a quick look here. First one coming in, Alex. Any tips to upskill all people managers on how to set key results and tasks in an effective and efficient manner? This person goes on to say, in my organization, some people managers are really not good at setting something that's aligned with the larger organizational objectives. I mean, you touched on this earlier, Alex, but in terms of training interventions on goal setting itself, how have you approached that with your clients at HRreview?
I think the fundamental part of it is to start with the reason why you're doing it. And I think oftentimes, and I think it happens to all of us, we stick to things we know and we're familiar with, because things that are new can feel a bit daunting. Or even if you've been doing the same thing in the same way for a long time, it's within your comfort zone, right? Like it's something you feel comfortable with. Trying something new can feel uncomfortable, can be a bit scary. It depends also on the level of psychological safety that people feel. Do they feel that they can actually say, I don't know how to do it? Or do I feel like I can make mistakes along the way? So I think, first of all, understanding your context is key. Highlighting the reasons why you're training people, and then trying to tap into those open and honest conversations with managers that have a more traditional way. I think it's fundamental to build trust to begin with, so that they can be open about how they feel about trying new things, or even to highlight it's okay to make mistakes as we go along learning something new.
Yeah. Another question here. This sounds like a slight challenge, Alex. This is interesting. Is it right to think that SMART objectives do not work for all types of roles? Oh, discuss.
Yeah. I think, well, we would need a specific example on what type of role, etc. But I feel potentially in roles where you have blurry boundaries, maybe you do too many things, and it's maybe we need to link it back to your role description, right? Is there a clear understanding of what your role is? If the answer is no, then I think maybe we need to start with that, to defining expectations.
The answer is, if it doesn't work for the role is wrong.
Right, exactly. If the role is confusing, then you need to start by refining the goal. But
that's a great
my
answer.
answer would be, I think you can always identify something in an explicit manner. So what you're trying to accomplish, it might be more, the measurable part might be more difficult for certain roles, but I think there's always something to be measured in order to understand if you're being successful. And then the alignment piece, how it aligns to a bigger purpose. I think you can always make that connection. I think oftentimes we assume, yeah, maybe there are certain roles where people don't feel that they're contributing, but that's from our bias point of view. Maybe the person that does a specific job see value in it, and it would be good to have those conversations to unearth that purpose and that alignment.
There's loads of questions coming in about goal setting for agile or multidisciplinary teams, and I want to get to that shortly, Alex. But first, there's one here that is something we touched on just at the end when we were talking through your takeaways, but is an area that I'm really fascinated in as well. Are there any considerations given to the negative effects of goal setting? And this person says, I'm thinking of maybe things like developing tunnel vision, which can lead to less creativity within the team. Sometimes stretching goals can also lead, we touched on this earlier, to unethical behavior. There's apparently a link to an article they've referenced here called Goals Gone Wild, which talks all about the difficulties of the behavior, the unintended behavior produced by poor goal setting, or the unintended consequences of goal setting. Just talk to us a little bit about that, Alex, about how you have to set goals in a way that ensures that you don't end up with behaviors that you don't want.
I think this question links to that part of not just recognizing and rewarding people for achieving goals or outcomes, and also recognizing and rewarding persistent effort. You mentioned creativity. There are things that contribute to people achieving things that might be a bit less measurable and tangible, and they might come up as part again of those conversations. So if managers and employees are aware, you can also recognize and say, yeah, I know you've tried this, and I know we have a specific event that changed that, but I wanna recognize you for all the effort, all the work you have put in, even if you haven't achieved a specific goal. As I said earlier, at least from the conversations I've had with clients, anchoring things to your values. So what is a set of expected behaviors? So how are people expected to behave in an organization is fundamental, and recognizing people that are role models of the values, even if commercially, we tend to link goals to financials or commercial. Maybe if there was a quarter where things were lower, but they still contribute to team building activities, etc. All that people sign can be a counterbalance, or to make things a bit more more balanced than just focusing on outcomes. Because it's true, if you only focus on outcomes, it can create undesired behaviors. Like An example that comes to mind is I heard once that there were some doctors in the US in specific hospitals that were rewarded for performing successful surgeries. But then on the surface, you might say, well, that's a good thing. If they're doing a good job, they should be rewarded. The unintended consequence is that a lot of doctors started only doing surgeries on patients that they thought were safe to do the surgeries, which created the unintended effect of maybe people that needed their help weren't helped because the doctor were like, well, I'm not sure if I'll be successful. Or even if it was a more challenging surgery, it didn't allow the doctors to develop those skills further through experience of having more complicated cases. It's just one example of many that I'm sure we have.
There are certain areas on there, medicine, education, where goal setting has been questioned as to the sort of, whether you end up with behavior that you're not aiming for. I want to finish very quickly, Alex. We're just about to run out of time. Just talking about goals with agile teams, where managers in the work involved in the work may be different from the line manager, for example. You've got people working on secondment to different teams who maybe business partnering, where they're working with teams. How easy is it, or how difficult is it to set common goals across different sprint cycles or different projects?
I think again, it goes back to the conversations, making things very explicit and realistic, but ambitious. So if you'll be working on many different projects, well, the goals maybe should be streamlined, and then you won't be creating 2 or 3 goals per project. You're just going to stick to one main goal, for instance. Also, if your it's a very good question, because at Culture, we recommend that the feedback is provided from a multi-source and not just the manager. That's something I should have mentioned earlier as well, that it's not just a manager. Your peers can have a say on how you are working, or how the things that you're doing.
Feedback.
Exactly. If you are part of different teams, by all means, have different team members or different managers having an input into the feedback you receive on how you work or how you achieve your goals.
Alex, thank you so much for your time this morning. That was a really fascinating hour. It was a pleasure to talk to you. Thanks for coming in. Come and do this again with us at some time, please.
Absolutely. Pleasure, James. So thank you for having me.